Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Heritage Foundation, to our Douglas and Sarah Allison Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. I would ask those in-house if you'll be so kind to make that last courtesy check that your mobile devices have been silenced or turned off. It is always appreciated. And for those watching online, you're always welcome to send questions or comments, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. And of course, we will post the program on the Heritage homepage following the presentation for everyone's future reference as well. Opening our discussion and leading our program is Hans von Spakovsky. He is our Senior Legal Fellow in the Edwin Meese Center for Legal and Judicial Studies. He also manages Heritage's Election Law Reform Initiative. He is an authority on a wide range of legal issues. He has co-authored a book, Who's Counting, with our friend John Fund. He has served as a member of the Federal Election Commission, worked on electoral commissions at the state and local level, also served as a counsel to the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, and is a former litigator, in-house counsel, and senior corporate officer in the insurance industry. Please join me in welcoming Hans von Spakovsky.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Heritage Foundation, and we're here to talk about climate change today and the criminalization of scientific dissent. Last year, late in the fall, 20 professors from a range of universities, including Columbia, Rutgers, and I'm embarrassed to say George Mason University, where I'm an adjunct at the law school, sent a letter to the President and to the U.S. Attorney General Loretta Lynch urging that the federal government and the Justice Department investigate and prosecute companies and others who deny that climate change is happening. Now, I was somewhat surprised by this because these individuals are in academic institutions which are supposed to be dedicated to the vigorous discussion and debate of public policy and other issues. This was followed up earlier this year by U.S. Attorney General Loretta Lynch, who was asked at a Senate Judiciary Oversight meeting by Senator Sheldon Whitehouse whether or not she was going to be investigating and prosecuting companies and others who deny that climate change is happening. Rather than saying that it's the job of the Attorney General of the United States to enforce the law based on the facts, she instead said that, well, they had been discussing that internally and that she had turned the matter over to the FBI to see if such an investigation would meet the criteria needed. In March of this year, more than a dozen state attorney generals held a press conference. They have formed a group called AGs United for Clean Power, and they have said that they are going to be launching investigations and prosecutions under their state versions of the federal RICO law. The federal RICO law is the Racketeer Influence and Corrupt Organizations Act, and as many of you may know, that was a law passed in the early 1970s intended by Congress to be used to go after and break up mob organizations and large drug cartels. This has resulted in the Virgin Islands Attorney General launching an investigation. He has subpoenaed not only ExxonMobil, but also the Competitive Enterprise Institute for all of their internal research, communications, and other items on climate change, including, for example, for the Competitive Enterprise Institute, if you can believe it, any op-eds and letters to the editor that they may have written in the public arena. Now, the individuals behind this say that this is required because climate change is so dangerous that something has to be done to stop any attempts to prevent legislation or other steps being taken by the United States to stop it. But others say that this is a fundamental violation of the First Amendment, that is an attempt to criminalize scientific dissent, something that we have seen before in history. And to talk about it today, we have people who've been working on this issue very directly, starting with the Attorney General of Texas. We're very honored to have him here, Ken Paxton. And I want to introduce all three speakers and then let them speak to you. Ken Paxton is the 51st Attorney General of the state of Texas. He's a former member of both the Texas House of Representatives and the Texas Senate. In just his first year in office, he filed 8 lawsuits against the federal government on environmental, healthcare, religious freedom, and immigration issues, as well as to stop over-regulation. In fact, he has been leading the lawsuit by 26 states, which is now before the U.S. Supreme Court, against the president's immigration amnesty plan. He's a graduate of Baylor University and the University of Virginia School of Law, and has experience both in private practice as and also as an in-house counsel. Now, relevant to our issue today, General Paxton and his colleague, Alabama Attorney General Luther Strange, recently filed a motion to intervene in a lawsuit filed in state court in Texas by ExxonMobil to squash the subpoena that had been served on them. Walker, who is the Attorney General of the Virgin Islands, Claude Walker, and a private plaintiffs law firm that General Walker hired are demanding decades worth of internal research on climate change and all of ExxonMobil's communications with a host of third parties, almost 100 different entities, including foundations, think tanks, universities, and individual scientists, researchers, and professors. Exxon says this investigation and subpoena are a fundamental violation of its free speech rights under the First Amendment and an abuse of power. Next, we're going to hear from Andrew Grossman. Andrew is a lawyer at Baker Hostetler and an expert on constitutional law. Along with David Rivkin, he has founded the Free Speech in Science Project to defend scientists, writers, businesses, and others targeted for speaking out on scientific issues and policy. He's a graduate of Dartmouth College, has an MGA from the University of Pennsylvania, and a law degree from George Mason University, where he graduated magna cum laude and won numerous awards. He clerked for Chief Judge Edith Jones of the Fifth Circuit. Now, Andrew, I know very well because he used to work in our legal center here at the Heritage Foundation before going into private practice, and the only thing negative I can say about him is that he's now an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute, our competitor organization here. Most importantly, however, Andrew, along with David Rivkin, is representing the Competitive Enterprise Institute, which was hit with a voluminous subpoena from the Virgin Islands AG, as I said, for decades worth of its research work and communications on climate change. David Kreutzer, who's going to end our discussion, is our research fellow in energy, economics, and climate change at the Heritage Foundation Center for Data Analysis. He researches how energy and climate change legislation will affect economic activity at the national, local, and industry levels. He has an undergraduate and master's degree from Virginia Tech, a PhD from George Mason University. He's taught at Ohio University and James Madison University and worked at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, and his research has appeared in everything from the Journal of Energy and Development to the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Times. Now, General Paxton. And by the way, you can speak from here, or if you all want to speak from there, whatever each of you would like.
Well, I feel a lot more comfortable. I'm on the right, and I always like to be on the right of things, so I feel good being over here. Thanks for having me. It's also good to be back in the Capitol. I went to law school, as he said, right down the street, the University of Virginia. And I also actually live in the capital of Texas, Austin, which is a pretty liberal county. And you may remember a couple of years ago, Governor Perry talking about Texas potentially seceding from the Union. What you didn't hear was leaders in Austin came back and said, well, if Texas secedes from the Union, we're seceding from Texas. So that's kind of where I live. I always tell people I don't mind living in Austin, even though it's liberal, because it's really not very far from Texas. So it's great to be here today. I want to give you a little background before I get into what our Exxon case, because I think the background is kind of the mentality that got us here, which I think is important to consider as we're going forward, because in some ways, you look at this Exxon, these Exxon subpoenas and subpoenaing these other organizations and kind of the direction they're going, it's kind of hard to believe that we're here. But when I was sworn in 15 months ago, a little over 15 months ago, by Governor Abbott, now Governor Abbott, who was the Attorney General of Texas, he said, Ken, you're going to be the busiest Attorney General in the history of the state. I thought, well, that's really interesting, but I didn't know what that meant. Well, I do now. We've had the opportunity to argue in front of the U.S. Supreme Court now 5 times in that 15 months. We've now filed 11 lawsuits against the federal government, from what he talked about, immigration, to Obamacare, 4 lawsuits against the EPA, and obviously this new lawsuit on Title IX and their redefinition of what bathrooms and lockers and showers people can use. And just that whole mentality of ignoring the Constitution and ignoring what Congress has done and just taking it unto themselves to make these changes in law. I think it's had a dramatic effect. It's had a dramatic effect on cities. We have cities now that are ignoring our regulatory body. We have a regulatory body in Texas called the Texas Railroad Commission, which oddly enough regulates the oil and gas industry. And we have cities now trying to stop fracking in their own little cities outside of state rules and state laws. And we've had to deal with that in the legislature and overcome that. Yesterday, 21 states, including Texas and Arkansas leading the way, just filed a lawsuit against the state of Delaware for not following federal law and keeping money that they're not entitled to keep under federal law. And so we have this whole sort of mentality that law doesn't matter, and if you're in a governmental organization, you can do what you want. And so we stepped into this Exxon case. It's sort of unique for us, really under 2 theories. The first theory being that this is a constitutional right of free speech, and that Exxon and all of these organizations that are listed as potential target organizations in this subpoena have First Amendment rights. And so they've gone after 40 years of records, which we think is unconscionable, merely because they have a difference of opinion on climate change. And then we're also equally concerned about this prosecutorial discretion and we have an AG from the Virgin Islands who has no assets from Exxon in his state, has no employees, has literally no connection to Exxon, and yet they are going after Exxon with criminal statutes, potentially prosecute them under RICO-type laws. And we don't think it's also a very sound constitutional idea for them to use outside counsel and potentially pay them, we don't know how they're paying them, but potentially with contingency fees, to incentivize prosecutions against companies and individuals. And so Texas has stepped up, and also Alabama, Luther Strange filed with us, and we will be fighting them all the way. And I really wanted to encourage other AGs, other Republican AGs, to consider this fight, because obviously the First Amendment, this criminalization of views is something we consider very serious in Texas, and I think you'll see as we go along more AGs involved in this fight, and if it turns out that other AGs get involved on the other side, I think it'll be an interesting process. But I do want to end with just a little message to the Attorney General of the Virgin Islands. You know, he's come, we view this as a complete fishing expedition, a legal fishing expedition by the Attorney General of the Virgin Islands. And my suggestion to him, rather than doing his fishing in the heartland of Texas, we think that actually he would be better fishing off the coast of the Virgin Islands. So that's our recommendation to him. So thank you all, and I look forward to answering questions.
Well, thank you, Hans, for that warm introduction earlier, and I'd like to thank everyone who came out today. And I'd particularly like to thank those of you who registered for this event. My understanding is the subpoenas will be coming shortly. I should begin with a disclaimer. I'm speaking today on my own behalf and not on behalf of my firm or any of its clients. I'd like to address 3 topics briefly. The first is to run down that the parameters of what is a campaign to punish dissent from the climate change consensus. Second, I'd like to identify why it is that this is something we should all be concerned about, no matter what our positions may be on the underlying climate change policy issues. And then third, I'd like to discuss what it will take to win. In other words, to beat back what really does seem to me to be a very serious threat to First Amendment rights. As Hans described, there really is a campaign that's going on here, and this is not by accident. This isn't a number of government officials all on their own deciding to investigate and potentially prosecute some instance of fraud that happens to have come within their jurisdictions. It's really quite different. The current RICO actions originated, as best anyone can tell, at an academic conference held in 2012 in California. That conference was sponsored by the Union of Concerned Scientists, the Rockefeller Foundations, and other large liberal donor groups. The ideas, of course, came from academia, which is always a wonderful source of ideas to protect our rights and further our American values. And it might have died there.
That might have been the end of this RICO push, but instead it was picked up by the plaintiffs' bar, who recognized that the possibility of civil RICO litigation promised enormous contingency fee awards, as had happened in the tobacco litigation and in other cases. So it seemed from 2012 through to about the end of last year that there really wasn't much going on. But what we do know is that there was a lot going on behind the scenes. There were plaintiffs' attorneys lobbying government officials. They were meeting with lots of activist groups. There was lots of coalition building going on over these 3 years, creating what has really become an unholy alliance between state officials who have very strong political views on climate change and plaintiffs' attorneys who are interested potentially in the financial aspects of suing on this particular issue. The RICO issue came to light again in 2015 in a floor speech and then a series of articles by Senator Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island, who proposed the idea of a federal racketeering investigation into ExxonMobil's public statements and advocacy on climate change. And that was followed up by another letter by climate scientists urging the same, as Hans discussed. What was less reported was that it turns out that Sheldon Whitehouse and his office actually helped to organize that climate science letter. And that all of these different groups and individuals apparently have been in contact with one another and very closely coordinating their efforts. The culmination of that was the AGs United for Clean Power coalition that was announced this year at a March 29th press conference featuring, of all people, former Vice President Al Gore. That press conference began with New York Attorney General Eric Schneiderman describing what he viewed as the looming threats of climate change and the necessity of federal action aimed at that particular issue. But instead of simply urging a clean power agenda or talking about different federal legislation that he would prefer or any type of policy-based response, he identified the cause of gridlock in Washington as being groups that he saw were polluting in some sense the debate, were causing this gridlock, and thereby were, in his view, in his words, endangering the planet. What he resolved was that this coalition of attorneys general would target these particular individuals and groups and companies and do it creatively, in his words. They would use any legal theory at their disposal. One of those actions, as Hans described, was the U.S. Virgin Islands investigation launched into ExxonMobil. According to the U.S. Virgin Islands, Exxon is, quote, engaged or is engaging in conduct misrepresenting its knowledge of the likelihood that its products and activities are contributing to climate change. It is engaged, in other words, in a racketeering conspiracy. In furtherance of that investigation, the U.S. Virgin Islands issued a subpoena to ExxonMobil naming 90 groups. That includes the Heritage Foundation, the host of this event today, the Cato Institute, the American Enterprise Institute, the Federalist Society, and even the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. It also issued a subpoena to the Competitive Enterprise Institute, which is my client. The Competitive Enterprise Institute was the only policy organization that was targeted, and that subpoena was extraordinarily broad, basically demanding everything that CEI had done over a period of 10 years relating to ExxonMobil or to climate change in any possible respect, including internal communications, external communications, publications, op-eds, letters to the editor, media statements, you name it, they demanded it. In New York Attorney General Eric Schneiderman has launched Martin Act investigations, that's a securities fraud statute, into both Exxon and Peabody Energy. Peabody, which at that point, this was about a year ago, was on the verge of filing for bankruptcy, wound up settling its claim, and I understand that Exxon continues to fight the investigation that has been launched against it. The California Attorney General Kamala Harris in January launched an investigation into whether Exxon, quote, lied to the public and its shareholders about the risk to its business from climate change. Similarly, members of Congress have been pushing the SEC to launch a similar investigation into ExxonMobil and to other energy companies. And finally, in March, as Hans described, Attorney General Loretta Lynch announced that a similar request had been referred to the FBI for it to consider whether or not to launch an investigation. We don't know the status. As I said, these are not individual events. These are all part of a coordinated enterprise to exert pressure on people who hold a particular political view. And I think that's something that should concern us all. Alexis de Tocqueville, of course, famously said, there is scarcely any political question that arises in the United States that is not resolved sooner or later into a judicial question. But this is something different. This isn't simply somebody asking a court to evaluate some factual dispute or a policy dispute or something like that. The idea here is to target and punish and chill the speech of people who hold a particular policy debate and thereby skew the debate. And this is something new, at least here in the United States. In the past, you can identify instances where government pressure was exerted against people for their political views, and those typically involved congressional letters and congressional investigations, and from time to time, congressional subpoenas. And that was bad enough. But this is something new. Here you have attorneys general, people who have taken an oath to uphold and to carry out the Constitution, who are identifying and launching criminal and civil investigations into people on the basis of their speech. This is not about any crime. It is about silencing policy views. Well, how do we know that? Isn't that just my opinion? We know it because they said so. And that's what makes this a little bit unique. At the AG's United for Clean Power press conference, Attorney General Schneiderman explained that the coalition would, quote, step into the breach left by gridlock in Washington by targeting what he called well-funded, highly aggressive, and morally vacant forces that are trying to block every step by the federal government to take meaningful action. He said that all the attorney generals participating would wield their powers, quote, creatively and aggressively to clear up confusion among the public concerning climate change. Make no mistake, this is about altering debate. It is about chilling and potentially and punishing and banning certain types of speech and certain advocacy of certain views. Schneiderman made clear that members of his coalition would take action against these particular parties they identified under, quote, a variety of theories, including consumer protection law, securities fraud laws, and anything involving defending taxpayers and pension funds. And indeed, the US Virgin Islands Attorney General Claude Walker made clear that that was the whole point of his investigation too. He said, quote, we intend to make it clear to our residents as well as the American people that we have to do something transformational on climate change. And he intends his investigation to encourage the public to, quote, look at renewable energy, which he said was the only solution. That's the mindset here, that there's a particular policy debate, there's only one solution, and anybody who disagrees with that potential solution is apparently engaged in some kind of criminal conspiracy. I think, needless to say, this is not the way that law enforcement typically operates. Typically, law enforcement officials seek to identify if there is a crime, and then they attempt to identify who it is who might have undertaken that crime, and then to figure out the truth. In this instance, they're going about it backwards. We already know who's guilty. The question is simply what charges we're going to bring against them. This is not about fraud. And I want to be clear about that, because that's really been the only top-level response from any of the attorneys general that we've heard to criticisms of their investigations. They've said, well, fraud is not free speech. You're wrapping yourself in the First Amendment. That's really, it's a First Amendment exception is what they say. But in its briefing in the litigation currently with the Competitive Enterprise Institute, the U.S. Virgin Islands Attorney General was asked to identify the basis of its fraud claims against ExxonMobil Corporation. And the CEI asked it, put your cards on the table. We think this is a retaliatory lawsuit. Why don't you show us what the basis for your investigation is? They came up out of apparently all of the research they had done with two quotations that they identified as being fraudulent and justifying their investigation. And let me just read those to you. Here's the first one. Quote, current scientific understanding provides limited guidance on the likelihood, magnitude, and time frame of physical risks such as sea level rise, extreme weather events, temperature extremes, and precipitation. According to the United States Virgin Islands Attorney General, that is a fraudulent statement. Here's the other one. International accords and underlying regional and national regulations for greenhouse gas reduction are evolving with uncertain timing and outcome, making it difficult to predict their business impact. Again, according to the United States Virgin Islands Attorney General, when ExxonMobil put this in a report, that was fraudulent. As I said, this is not about fraud. These investigations violate the First Amendment in at least 4 separate ways. First, they attempt to silence a particular viewpoint. Second, they're retaliation for past speech and advocacy. Third, they seek to punish associations and expressive associations, which are protected by the First Amendment. And fourth, they seek to compel the disclosures of expressive associations and policy organizations' internal communications. There's a wide body of case law holding that these types of punitive and retaliatory investigations, which are clearly intended to further future harassment and retaliation, have the result of making it impossible for advocacy organizations to operate and advocate effectively. That's a violation of First Amendment rights. And yet somehow the big First Amendment story over the past couple months has been Hulk Hogan. And I guess to be fair, the involvement of a Silicon Valley billionaire in helping to fund Hulk Hogan's litigation against Gawker. Now, it would seem to me that whatever First Amendment issues that may raise, and maybe they're serious and maybe they're not, they pale in comparison to a coalition of 20 or more state attorney generals announcing publicly that they intend to target and take punitive action against a wide variety of companies, organizations, and individuals for their constitutionally protected advocacy. As I said, this is something new, at least for the United States. Some people have thrown around the words McCarthyism. I think that's a little bit different. I think it's a little bit distinguishable. But I think perhaps the more apt term is Lysenkoism. And let me, in preparation for this, I just looked it up. What is the general sense of that word? And of course, I consulted the font of all wisdom, Wikipedia. And Wikipedia says that Lysenkoism is the manipulation or distortion of the scientific process as a way to reach a predetermined conclusion as dictated by an ideological bias, often related to social or political objectives. Do we have political objectives here? Yes, of course, they announced them. They're the AGs United for Clean Power. Are they attempting to manipulate a debate on a public policy issue? Well, that's what they say they're doing. I leave it to those considering this question to draw the necessary inference, but I think there is a pretty close fit. And I want to say that this isn't just going to stop with climate science. Climate science, of course, is a very controversial issue, but this technique of attempting to criminalize and punish speech and advocacy on particular issues is by no means limited to that area. Robert Kennedy Jr., for example, has come out recently saying that vaccine makers are engaged in a RICO conspiracy, I guess to compel people to, or mislead people about the benefits of vaccinating their children. Other people have posited there are RICO conspiracies involved in the use of sugar in food products. If this wins in the climate science arena, if these tactics are allowed to prevail, if they aren't stamped out, we're going to see this type of technique and this type of campaign spread all across the political spectrum to every single policy issue that you can imagine. The last thing I would note, just in terms of the concern about this, is that at base, this isn't, and it shouldn't be an ideological issue. This is bad both for science and for public policy. Justice Brandeis recognized decades ago that free speech is not merely a good in and of itself, but it's how we conduct our self-government, and it's how we understand the truth and reach the truth. As he explained, fear of serious injury alone cannot justify suppression of free speech and assembly. Men feared witches and burnt women. It is the function of speech to free men from the bondage of irrational fears. And if those fears are correct, the purpose of speech is to confirm those fears and help the public understand how to address them. Simply silencing one side of the debate doesn't allow that to happen. Now, to conclude, let me just explain why I think we've got a little bit of good news today. The thugs haven't won yet. But I think the coming months are going to be crucial. Since we announced the Free Speech and Science Project, we've received overwhelming support across the ideological spectrum, and I find that to be very encouraging. Exxon, in response to the subpoena that it received, launched a Section 1983 civil rights action to vindicate its rights, as well as filed charges against the U.S. Virgin Islands Attorney General for abusive process. CEI, for its part, objected to the subpoena that it received, saying that it was, quote, offensive, it is un-American, it is unlawful, and it will not stand. In response to CEI's request for sanctions, the U.S. Virgin Islands Attorney General sought to terminate the subpoena action in D.C., and basically, in doing so, effectively conceded the lack of any legal support for its action against CEI. The major question remaining in that case is whether the U.S. Virgin Islands Attorney General will have to pay for abusing the court's authority to issue a subpoena in the first place. These people don't have a legal leg to stand on, and I think they know it. I don't think they ever expect to secure any type of conviction or civil liability or anything of that sort. In their view, the process is the punishment. Maybe they can get some people to roll over. They expect the companies and groups, when faced with legal risk, will simply settle, and that will be the end of it. And that, in turn, will lend momentum for further legal actions. But what those of us who view these tactics with disdain need to do is to fight back. We need to make clear that settlement isn't an option. We need to make clear that parties aren't going to roll over. And we need to make clear that in this instance, the process can't be the punishment. There needs to be the resources available to fight this effort. And particularly in the next wave of actions, which we anticipate will probably target more policy organizations, perhaps individual scientists, and potentially policy experts, people who, in the normal course of affairs, may not be able to mount a very strong defense themselves. They're going to need the resources so they can continue doing the work that they do, and so that they won't be cowed by these particular efforts. Finally, I think the last component of this pushing back against this campaign is really what Attorney General Paxton and Attorney General Luther Strange have done, which is to shame the people who are involved, to shine a spotlight on their abuses. This is simply an abuse of governmental power, and it's offensive when attorney generals from some states reach out to residents of other states and attempt to violate their civil rights. I think it's very appropriate and necessary that attorney generals like Ken Paxton and Luther Strange have gotten involved in this fight, and I commend them for doing so, and my hope is that more will be able to join in this effort. There's a lot of work to be done, but at the end of the day, I think we can win. Thank you.
Well, I'm not an attorney, but it seems to me that if that always gets an applause on that one. If they're going to include CEI and Exxon in this RICO case, that they ought to include the EPA, NOAA, and the National Climatic Data Center as well, because they are actually the ones that are casting doubt on the consensus, with quotation marks, climate science. And they do that by providing data. CEI and the others, all the great work that they do, mostly just point to government data. For instance, we hear that virtually all of the recent temperature increase is due to man. That's apparently a consensus, though that doesn't come out of the studies that claim there's consensus. That seems unlikely given this data that I got. Do I point it at something? There we go. Nope, okay. There. This is a chart of temperatures from the EPA. I looked for temperatures that went back as far as possible, and they had some that went back 3 million years. Of course, there were no thermometers then, and what they've used was proxy data from ratios of oxygen isotopes in the seabed. But we can see there's quite a bit of variation. They're over that million years, they're 10, 20, jumps up of 3, 4, 5, 10, 15 degrees, okay? Clearly that was not due to ExxonMobil. If you look at the time scale, that just a single sort of pinpoint on that would be maybe 1,000 years. And so the Industrial Revolution is kind of smeared in that last little pinprick there. But then we're told all of the temperature increase since then has been due to man. Now, what we also know, or what we can surmise, since the proxy data do not show recent temperature changes, that there has to be a fuzzy band around all of that noise that's there for those temperatures. That very likely were temperature increases of much shorter duration than 1,000 years, decades or centuries as well. But it seems unlikely that all of that was caused by nature, and nothing since then has been caused by nature. Okay. This chart was not taken from NOAA data. It was produced by a NASA scientist, John Christie. What he plotted in red is the model predictions that are supposedly the consensus. Now you have to wonder about consensus science when they can't even bring the consensus closer than several hundred models, okay? They have, well, hundreds of models anyway, over 100 models that they have to predict the future temperature, okay? So John Christie, who's a NASA award-winning scientist at the University of Alabama, Huntsville, who's one of the 2 scientists that's in charge of the satellite that NASA has that actually measures the temperature via satellite. He took those models and found the average projections, starting them in 1979, and that's where you get the red line. All right. The trouble is the data don't comport with that, and that's the whole trouble with all of the climate hysteria, is that the future projections of catastrophic global warming, not just warming, there's a lot of consensus that we've seen warming, and that some portion of it is due to human emissions of CO2. But how much? That's the critical thing. So if you look at the catastrophic projections, you need the models, and the models don't fit with the data. All right, so where do the light blue and the dark blue lines come from? All right, one of them is the actual satellite measurement since 1979. The other is weather balloon measurements, and they are fairly close. In correspondence, neither of them correspond with the projections from the models. Okay, so let me go back though. What if we say, for the sake of argument, okay, all of the warming for the last 50 years, or 100 years, or 30 years, you pick the time. That's to wake you up. Let's say that all of that is due to man-made emissions of CO2. So what? Well, look at that. Don't look at the model projections. Look at the data. Where's it pointing to? It's pointing to maybe a degree of warming for the rest of this century. That's not catastrophic. Okay. Sea level rise. Here we have sea level rise from tide gauges in the blue line and from satellite data in the last part there in the red, from about, 1880 or so. Is it accelerating? I don't know. Using what we call in economics ocular least squared, or OCS, which is a play on the statistical term. So I'm glad 3 of you got it. There does not seem to be any accelerating sea level rise. It looks pretty constant to me. All right, maybe if you take the upper part of the error band for the first 30 years and the lower part for the next 30 years and then go back to the upper, you might be able to get some convexity in that, but it looks fairly flat. Certainly not accelerating. Look at this scale since 1880. Scale, we're talking about inches, about 8 inches of sea level rise in the past 130, 40 years. Okay. Well, let's look at sea level rise. And so we're arguing about whether the next 100 years is going to be another 8 inches, or is it going to be 16 inches? Some people say it's going to be a couple of feet. That appears less and less likely the longer we look at the incoming data, but let's say it is a couple of feet. Look at the scale here. Since the last ice age, sea levels have risen 400 feet. So if it were to rise another 4 feet, that would be 1% of that. Now, if you go back 20,000 years, we were in the Stone Age. They had just invented bows and arrows, all right? Over the course of the next 10,000 years, they started to develop agriculture. So about 10,000 years ago, in the Fertile Crescent, they're planting wheat and barley. That was, 150 feet of sea level rise ago. We made it, didn't we? And all the technology we had for most of that was stone. All right, 5,000 years ago, we get bronze. I think with the technology we have today, we'll be able to handle a couple of feet of sea level rise if we do get it, okay? So it's nothing catastrophic. And it looks like we're not even going to have sea level rise measured in feet, okay? That is a chart taken from the same data set that the first temperature chart was, the very wiggly one that showed the ice ages. All right, so it's probably smoother than what we saw in reality. Those two were put together to try to make sure they matched up with each other, but it's very roughly, that's what we've had. The other thing you're likely to hear is that evidence of climate change and damaging climate change and costly climate change, we're already seeing it. We're seeing it in extreme weather. We're seeing it in storms, being the hurricanes are more damaging than they used to be, the tornadoes are more frequent, and so on. Simply not true. This is a chart lifted directly from the NOAA's website. I cut and pasted it, okay? So you go to the National Climatic Data Center site, and you can plug in the years, and they show this is tornado frequency since, I don't have my glasses on, I think it's roughly 1950, 1954, something like that. 1954 to 2014, pretty much no trend there. It's not upward rise, it's not accelerating. So people that say we're seeing more storminess, they are the ones that are misleading, all right? The actual NOAA data say that's not true. And if you go to that website, and if you want to find the link to it, you can go, I have a blog called something like 5 myths or 6 myths. You gotta have a number now at the beginning of your blog posts. Of global warming and extreme weather. So if you plug in Kreutzer myths of extreme weather, you will go to my blog post that will have links that will take you to these pages provided NOAA hasn't eliminated them before you get there. Hope they may not be watching anyway. Okay. But okay, Kreutzer, yes, we don't have more tornadoes, but we know the heat is going to make more moisture in the air, which is going to allow the convection to be more violent. We're going to have more violent storms. Well, let's look. This is the violent tornadoes, okay, in the Fujita scale, 3 and higher. Again, from 1954 to 2014. And no, we don't see an upward trend. As a matter of fact, it looks like a downward trend. Whether it's statistically significant or not, I don't know. One thing I can guarantee you, if we go back to the level of violent tornado frequency that we had in the 1970s, all you will hear is that this is confirming evidence of climate change, man-made climate change. If we go back to what we used to have, that will be confirmation of something terrible coming in the future. So just be ready for that. We're going to have periods, almost certainly, where we have lots more violent tornadoes than we've had in the past few years. All right? How can I make this prediction confidently? Because we've had it in the past. Okay? And we see these cycles. They go up and down. So we're likely to see it again. Again, data lifted directly from NOAA's National Climatic Data Center website. This is not denier numbers, okay? This is not denier science, and so they need to be subpoenaed. Okay, the droughts, clearly there's evidence, isn't it, that we're having costly, catastrophic climate change has already started. Just look in the Southwest, just look in California. You can see those numbers, you can see the maps. They've had drought for years now. Well, if you look at the data, and this is something called the Palmer Hydraulic Drought Index for the contiguous continental United States, we see that there's really no trend up or down. We have years in a row where there's a lot of drought. We have years in a row where it's wet. We have years where it's not too far off the middle. If you look at paleo data on droughts in the Southwest United States, you go back 1,000 years, 1,500 years, and they have had droughts that have lasted over a century. All right, this, we hate to tell you people that are living there, what we're seeing now is not the worst that can happen with or without more CO2. Okay, so there's no trend in tornadoes. There's no trend in strong tornadoes. There's no accelerating sea level rise. All right, there's no trend in droughts or floods. All right. This is all from NOAA data, the government's own data. Okay. How about hurricanes? Well, this is hurricane data from about 1885 or so until the past couple of years. The red is the annual one, then they've smoothed out with a 5-year average to get the darker black line. And it looks pretty noisy. Though you can see it looks like it was high at the start of the series. It trended down. In the middle, there was a blip up. Then it fell down again. Now we're back up at a higher spot in general, okay, with a lot of noise in there. What I find discouraging is if you go to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and find their description, they say, yes, over the 50 or 100-year period, we don't really see any trend in tropical cyclones. They say, but we have seen a trend since the 70s that's very definite, implying that that's due to man-made emissions of CO2. But if you look here on this chart, you see, yeah, in the 70s, we're at the nadir of that chart. Of course, if you pick your endpoints from a low point of a sine wave to the high point, you can call that a trend, but it's not a trend. Okay. Now, what is causing that? What is causing tornadoes? I don't know. There's lots of stuff going on. I'm not a hurricaneologist, but on this same website, okay, this NOAA website, where it's called climate science or something, or weather science, it's a sub-web page of the NOAA web page. They kindly put this down. You think like there's scientists there that are trying to sneak out the information, maybe hoping they don't get noticed is my guess. What we have here is that same black line we saw from the previous chart of hurricane frequency averaged out over 5 years. The beige and blue bars are a measure of something called the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation. And so you have cold phases, which are blue, and the warm phases, which are beige. All right, and they seem to correspond more closely with the frequency of hurricanes than do CO2 emissions or CO2 levels, which have been fairly constantly growing. And we don't see any constant change in hurricanes. They seem to follow fairly closely the AMO. And we, partly due to good luck and partly due to slightly better weather, but mostly good luck, we have not had a hurricane landfall in the United States of Category 3 or higher for over 10 years now. So that is bad news for people that like to tell stories of catastrophe, because what they like these images. They liked Hurricane Sandy. By the way, there's been no trend in that. Was called an extratropical cyclone, something like that. Okay. Superstorm. It was a superstorm because it met up with something else. Okay, so we're not having the trend in hurricanes, in spite of, if you take the starting point at 1970 and go to 2015. We're not having trends in tornadoes. We're not having trends in floods. We're not having trends in droughts. We're not having trends in any of these extreme weather events that we're supposed to be seeing. If you look at the temperature, we're not on any catastrophic trend. It has been rising, as it has been since on and off, more or less, since the Little Ice Age. If you look at the models, that's where you get the catastrophe, but they don't match up with the data. I think this is the end of my talk. So the point is, it's easy to cast doubt on the science that says we're heading to catastrophic climate change, because all you have to do is use the government's data. Okay, thank you.
All right, we have just a few minutes for questions, and if you do have a question, if you could just wait for the microphone, because we are broadcasting out on the internet, and just if you would identify yourself, please, and please make sure it's a question and not a panel presentation. Good.
Hi, Paul Cameron, our Washington attorney. Yeah, Andrew, real quick, the legal basis, they're saying this is fraud under RICO. Could you explain that a little bit? Is it mail fraud, wire fraud? Who's being defrauded? Is there a contract involved, or is this a false statement claim? And then to Dr. Kreutzer, in terms of assuming that the other side is right, that this is all man-made, causing these alleged problems, the solution being to reduce our carbon emission in the U.S., where China and India is doing it. I mean, what effect that would even that have? So those are two questions. Thanks.
Sure, Paul. In terms of what kind of fraud we're talking about, to be honest, it's been very vague. I've heard a lot thrown around about, mail fraud and wire fraud and this and that. But, until you see charges or something like that written up, it's difficult to be very precise about it. A lot of people seem to be using mail fraud and wire fraud in the sense that somebody said something I disagree with, therefore it's fraud. The one area where we do have a little bit more concrete insight on this involves the U.S. Virgin Islands investigation, and what they claim there is that there is the equivalent under state law of, mail fraud, and their view is that somehow ExxonMobil, by being the one party on the face of the earth who knew the truth about climate change, somehow managed to defraud the state or the public or perhaps some kind of Virgin Islands pension fund by not disclosing the truth that only they knew. That said, it's still pretty vague.
Yeah, the question about what the policy to do is a great one. If you can picture that the diagram I had of the model's projection of temperature, which was the red line, and then we had the satellite and weather balloon data on the blue lines way below it. Two of the climate scientists at Cato, Chip Knappenberger and Pat Michaels, have put what they call a handy-dandy global warming or carbon tax calculator, something. And you can plug in cuts in CO2 emissions from the U.S. and from the developed world altogether to see how much of an impact it would have on moderating future temperatures. And they built it on a model that essentially uses the same sensitivity as that red line. So you say we're giving the IPCC everything. We're saying, okay, yeah, the data for some reason are wrong, your model's right. And even if, okay, your model's right, the policies would have negligible impact. You could zero out CO2 emissions from the US and the rest of the developed world, and you might moderate future temperatures by 0.4 degrees centigrade. All right, that's at the upper end. All right, in all likelihood, it would be less than that.
Time for one more question. Yeah. Hey, wait for the mic.
I'm Joel Mandelman. I'm also an attorney here in Washington. Paul asked one of the questions I was going to bring up. Has any thought been given to telling people, especially like the Attorney General in the Virgin Islands, that there's an election coming up, there might be a new Attorney General, and Section 234 of Title 18 makes it a federal crime, this is apart from 1983, for two or more people to conspire to deprive anybody of rights guaranteed by the Constitution. And even if you couldn't do it right now, threatening them with criminal prosecutions down the road might slow them down more than a little bit.
Well, you know, I certainly understand that the U.S. Virgin Islands Attorney General is well aware of the view that his actions do constitute a violation of federal civil rights, not least because ExxonMobil brought a lawsuit making just that claim, and I think doing so in a fairly persuasive way. Likewise, CEI, in its response to the subpoena, laid out pretty exhaustively why it is that action constitutes a civil rights violation. You know, as to what the next administration will do, presumably it'll do what it does. But I think there is a broad understanding that what's going on here is a very serious civil rights issue.
And
The ExxonMobil case was brought in Texas state court. It was removed to federal court in Texas, and there are currently proceedings going on right now to potentially remand it back to state court. The CEI litigation over the subpoena is proceeding right now in the D.C. Superior Court.
All right, and I should say on this topic that about 2 weeks ago, 5 United States senators actually sent a letter to Attorney General Loretta Lynch demanding that she immediately cease all investigations and possible prosecutions in this matter, and then asked what was she going to do in terms of trying to stop state actors who were violating the civil rights of citizens of the United States. And there's so far not been any response yet to that letter. Well, we are out of time. I want to thank our guests for coming, including General Paxton, who I know has a very busy schedule, but also Andrew Grossman and David Kreutzer. Thank you very much, and if we could give them a round of applause. I appreciate it.